close my eyes. I'm scared to open them.
The Blair Witch Project was a cultural phenomenon. Its influence on horror cinema and transmedia is unquestionable, given how it came out in the right place at the right time to capitalise on the growing ubiquity of the internet in our everyday lives. When I first covered the historical impact of the 1999 found footage flick directed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez nearly 4 years ago, it was to coincide with the release of Adam Wingard's 2016 sequel-esque reboot, which came out of nowhere, and just last year the same could even be said about Blooper Team's surprise video game adaptation. It got me thinking about Blair Witch as a franchise and how, despite having 2 film sequels, 4 video games, over 10 books, and a supposed television series in the works, none of it really amounted to much, at least not on the same level that Paranormal Activity cultivated several years later. The Blair Witch Project kinda succeeded on what could be cynically described as a gimmick that perfectly captured the social and technological zeitgeist of sensationalist media and our growing demand for information consumption, despite there being way too much information out there that it now blurs the line between fact and fiction. The movie itself is secondary to what it represented. It worked purely on the idea that no other film at the time looked or felt as authentic that surely it must be real. It's so anti-cinematic and audience-unfriendly that you're left more curious than scared. Well, depending on whether you bought into it or not. However, the 3 core mainstream adaptations that followed over the next 20 years are, to put it bluntly, completely the opposite of everything that the original film tried to steer clear from. But does that mean that they're bad? Well, let's talk about it. So the 3 adaptations I'm looking at are Book of Shadows, which released just over a year after the first film, 2016's reboot that tried to expand on the original story, and just for general fearmongering, I have a few things to say about the 2019 video game that I think summarise my perspective on the series and its potential future. Starting with Book of Shadows is a bit of a paradox because despite technically being the most shameless cash-in on the original film's success, it's also somehow the most complex and unique film to try and make sense of. And that already says a lot about it as a sequel to a minimalist supernatural found footage movie.
Bullshit!
They're in the car.
Oh, bullshit!
To Book of Shadows' credit, it's ambitious to say the least. Instead of simply expanding on the original with bigger production values and jump scares, which is more or less what the 2016 film did, Book of Shadows goes for a meta film within a film style approach that tries to play into the cultural zeitgeist I mentioned in the opening. It starts with a surprisingly introspective introduction by showing us how much of an impact the Blair Witch Project had at the time, from commentaries to fan imitations to people banking off its success, to even the frustration felt by the locals of Burkittsville, Maryland, after it became a tourist hotspot and mangled their reputation as a quaint, peaceful little town.
Get out of these woods and go home! There is no goddamn Blair Witch!
After which, the story focuses on one specific fan called Jeff, who takes a group of people on a location tour of the film, consisting of a Wiccan, a couple researching mythology and mass hysteria, and an obligatory late 90s, early 2000s goth chick. And from there, things get wild and weird, shall we say.
Coffee.
Next to your arm.
Basically, after a night of partying in the forest, the group awaken to find all their possessions destroyed and head back to Jeff's home to investigate the surveillance tapes, only for each of them to begin hallucinating creepy shit because the story needs to remind us it's supposed to be a horror movie. It's worrying when a film can be described as both contrived and convoluted. You'd think being a studio mandate sequel that was rushed into production immediately after the original became a smash hit would lead it to becoming a shallow imitation of the first film, but Book of Shadows is one of those rare cases of attempting to over-deliver on its premise. It's filled with all the typical late 90s, early 2000s schlock you'd expect from a cash-in like this, such as the awful hammy acting, flashy music video inspired imagery, and shitty chin fluff goatees. But I'll admit, while stylistically it's everything the Blair Witch Project is not, the plot itself is actually pretty decent once you decipher what the hell is going on.
It's a little scary.
Actually, some of these symbols are quite positive. Only those who don't understand witchcraft would be afraid of them.
Essentially, as the title suggests, Book of Shadows really tried to lean on the whole Wiccan mythology angle by setting up the revelation that the group had been marked for death as part of a demonic ritual inspired by such practices.
Bodies were laid out in the shape of a pentagram. Sound familiar?
However, it ends up resorting to melodramatic witchcraft in a desperate bid to be scary, and the whole thing spirals out of control to the point of being incomprehensible, although it is fitting to the context of the story, even if it's clearly not deliberate.
What is your problem?
You're with the witch people.
Lady, I'm just here to buy groceries.
Witch!
The film's real twist comes in its conclusion when the group find the Wiccan girl Erica dead and suspect that the pregnant woman Tristan was possessed by the Blair Witch and taunting them this entire time, leading her boyfriend to impulsively push her off the balcony to her death after the Blair Witch supposedly manipulates him. Finally, when each of them are interrogated by the police, a series of videotapes reveal that the group committed a series of murders, while the final tape of Tristan's hanging is distorted to make it seem like the group deliberately ganged up against her and hanged her for being a witch.
Fucking witch? This isn't wrong.
So here's the thing, on paper it's a solid concept, but in execution, a lot of what director and co-writer Joe Berlinger was trying to say and do just doesn't translate all that effectively. Berlinger is primarily a true crime documentarian more so than a conventional director, and his style of social justice filmmaking was the main inspiration for the Netflix documentary aesthetic that was popularized by Making a Murderer. In fact, Berlinger executively produced a fair few of these documentaries and is responsible for both Netflix's Ted Bundy documentary and the Zac Efron film that accompanied it. In Berlinger's vision, Book of Shadows was meant to be about emphasizing the cultural impact of the original Blair Witch Project. It was meant to explore how outcasts, the superstitious, and those who felt alienated from conventional society were unified by the film, including some questionable attempts to bring mental illness into the equation. The opening is indicative of what Berlinger ultimately wanted to make, and even acts as a partial meditation on the media blurring the lines between fact and fiction. It briefly demonstrates the media's growing sensationalization of the truth to the point that a falsehood is misconstrued as exaggeration or hyperbole. In fact, it represented fake news before fake news was even a mainstream concept. There's even some attempt to address the media's portrayal of fear-mongering violence, which feels even more realized today when other fictional phenomenons like the Slender Man led to legitimate attempted murder.
Stabbed 19 times, allegedly by two of her friends, who said they were trying to impress a fictional internet character called Slender Man.
I mean, it's all well and good Berlinger saying this, but watching the film, you would be forgiven for not recognizing this as the motive. The film just does not have the simplicity or subtlety to make its commentary feel genuine and informed. I appreciate the idea of how it plays into cultural superstition to the point it's become a very lucrative industry, but then the film gets so caught up in trying to turn its human drama into a supernatural psychological showcase of shit where none of its horror feels earned. The reason for this is very simple. The studio meddled so much with Berlinger's vision that what we ended up with was a mangled conflict of ideas. Artisan Entertainment forced Berlinger to make the film more commercial and less ambiguous by adding more gore and horror elements that detract from Berlinger's themes. And while you'd think the film's jarring style of intercutting scenes out of context and non-chronologically was a filmmaking choice, it was actually the studio's decision for wanting to apparently make it seem more mysterious and surprising, yet all they really did was end up shooting themselves in the foot and making the film more inaccessible and confusing as a result. Book of Shadows was a critical and commercial failure, and while it's easy to dismiss it as simply karma for being a blatant cash grab, I honestly think Berlinger's vision could have perfectly complemented the original film, and hell, even potentially added to what made Blair Witch a cultural milestone if it embraced the opening aftermath angle rather than the traditional storytelling structure. After Book of Shadows' massive failure, it wasn't until 16 years later that Blair Witch would return with a reboot, premiering at Comic-Con in 2016. It came as a total surprise to everyone because the studio kept the project completely under wraps with the working title The Woods. And yes, it could have very easily have existed without the Blair Witch title, but obviously it was done for marketing purposes. The story here ignores the existence of Book of Shadows and jumps 20 years after the events of the original, where Heather's brother James discovers a YouTube video containing what he believes to be his missing sister and puts together a team to track her down. It's pretty much a by-the-numbers found footage flick that goes back to basics and manages to elevate itself by generally nailing most of the scares with a more bombastic, provocative and stylized execution. I understand a lot of purists of the original will hate it for these reasons, but what's so wonderful about Wingard's films is how in touch he is with younger modern audiences. The film knows it can't replicate the magic of the original, so it doesn't try to, nor does it go for the contrived exposition angle of explaining the Blair Witch. Instead, it aims to capture a feeling of dread and discomfort perpetuated in the original, while lightly alluding to new information like how staring at the wall stops the Blair Witch from attacking you, rounding it off by giving you a few glimpses of a genuinely terrifying creature that, at least for me, greatly surpassed my expectations of what this Blair Witch really is. I always say explaining a creature kills the mystery, but Blair Witch adds just enough momentum to the concept without completely spoiling said mystery. Sure, it kills the authenticity, but you've had over 20 years to realize it's all bullshit, so I don't think it detracts too much from the original spirit, and simply modernizes it to appeal to an audience now desensitized to authenticity. Again, it doesn't try to force any definitive answers, but instead give you ambiguous nuggets of information to piece together your own understanding of the events that transpire, such as the inescapable time loop, the emphasis on tree symbolism, and this shocking body horror sequence that, while slightly out of place, plays into how much omnipotence the Blair Witch has over the forest. Dare I say, it's even possible to argue that it makes the original more effective from a conceptual point of view, because it adds a greater cosmic angle which goes hand in hand with Book of Shadows, despite it being treated as non-canon. Sure, we definitely don't need this information, but it doesn't hurt it either, especially when it's convincingly well executed that you can forgive some of its shortcomings. The sound design is especially spectacular. While the forest isn't much to look at, the film sounds ferociously brooding almost the entire time, and gets increasingly more otherworldly and unnatural as we get deeper into the forest. There is a persistent feeling like something is watching the group the entire time, and while there are a few typical jump scares, some do legitimately work and add to the disorientation and hysteria. It definitely leans on the younger, excitable crowd and even applies a few modern twists like GoPros and drones, yet it doesn't really do anything commentative with it like the original did with the whole accessibility of mobile technology. All it does is serve to give us multiple angles off events, which is just straight up cheating, to be honest. Although you could say on a cultural level, Blair Witch can be viewed as an indirect contrast to how audience tastes and sensibilities have changed over the years. One is minimalistic, subtle, drawn out, even boring, while the other has a shorter, more hyperactive attention span where it needs to confront its audience more directly to gain a reaction. Hell, it's even reflected onto the characters where the original's cast were patient, prepared, and respectful, unlike the 2016 version where the characters are the complete opposite due to how dependent we've become on a technologically and globally modernized world.
Please let me just put the tent together, okay? I just need to put the tent together right now. It's not supposed to be bent, I know. So you just bent. Is this supposed to be bent?
So earlier when I mentioned fear-mongering regarding the video game adaptation, what I meant was that after playing this game, I can totally see Blair Witch becoming a Cloverfield situation, where you take any found footage story set in a forest, slap a few connections to the original on there, and voila, you're a Blair Witch property. That's exactly what the 2019 video game adaptation is. Don't get me wrong, it's a serviceably creepy walking simulator with impeccable sound design reminiscent of the 2016 film, and a brilliant climax where you explore the infamous house. But other than the spooky forest, totems, and a camcorder, it's so far removed from Blair Witch on a narrative level. The story follows a war veteran called Ellis as he joins a search party looking for a missing child in the Black Hills forest of Burkittsville, where the events of the first film took place. Eventually, Ellis gets stuck in a time loop and gradually unravels as he hunts down a serial killer while experiencing hallucinations of his days in the military and battling these creepy phantom monsters that look like the creatures from the live-action Scooby-Doo movie. Again, like Cloverfield, if you remove the title, it's easier to view the narrative a lot less cynically because the game basically just becomes another cliched, flashy psychological horror dealing with grief and post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's today's fashionably emotional character trait. However, there is a good dog called Bullet that accompanies you throughout, so it gets an immediate 10 out of 10. I don't make the rules, that's just how it is. Yet, it's fair to say the dog also plays another cynical cliche to the story of being your comfort buffer to depend on when things get scary, before eventually becoming a shallow tragic plot point where obviously the dog's safety becomes your number one priority. It does have a pretty effective sequence where you find Bullet badly hurt and the Blair Witch taunts you to leave the dog behind, which you can do so if you want to escape quicker, or you can spend over 5 minutes in a repetitive loop where the game rewards your tenacity for not abandoning the dog. For the record, no matter which ending you get, the dog lives, so thank God for that. All your actions do is influence whether the dog leaves the forest sad or scared. Ellis, on the other hand, is a pretty standard white male protagonist who's likeable enough to get you through the story, and during several sequences where you're able to get signal on your phone, you can choose whether or not to contact your ex-wife Jess and try to rekindle your relationship. I think giving you the choice to play Ellis as reclusively suppressing his emotions or trying to confront his fears is contextually quite neat, but again, it's painfully cliched and doesn't really amount to much other than whether you want a good ending or not. Of course, it only makes sense to do everything you can because there's more story beats to discover regarding Ellis's character, so it makes the option to engage or not seem artificial at best. The game's most unique feature is utilising the camcorder to play back tapes that manipulate the environment around you. Say your path is blocked by a fallen tree, just rewind the tape with the tree falling and your path is clear. It's a fantastic feature that plays into the time loop established in the 2016 film, along with sequences where the game disorientates your understanding of time and location to the point it absolutely nails the anxiety of being lost in a forest. Within 10 minutes of starting, I was already lost, and as such, the exploration and discovery of new locations does feel earned, and comes close to capturing the emotional beats experienced by the characters in the films. It does make it a little tedious at times, but the series is no stranger to it, so it's not entirely out of the ordinary. Naturally, the combat is the most polarizing issue, but it is kind of forgivable in the sense that the game would not be as threatening to play if there wasn't some element of danger, although it would have been more appropriate for the danger to be environmental or utilize the same technique used in the Slender Man game, because sometimes the game just falls straight into complete ridiculousness, with these silly tumbleweed creatures that feel something right out of a Stephen King novel. The game's big substantial twist comes in the ending, where it's revealed Ellis was the killer this entire time. Ooh, what a plot twist, straight out of the early 2000s, as you'd expect. So while it's era appropriate, I guess, it is cheap to today's standards. The real point I want to make about the game is that it really shows you the evolution of the Blair Witch series as a whole, going from a minimalist thriller about a bunch of kids lost in a forest to a psychological horror about time distortion to a return to minimalism combined with a creature feature to this Frankenstein mishmash of every single horror trope imaginable about a traumatized war veteran turned child napping serial killer. As a journey, it actually represents an evolution, or rather in some cases a de-evolution of mainstream horror. It's not to say the genre is failing, if anything it's on form at the minute, but with each new major release, studios seem to struggle to comprehend what audiences really want. Hell, they don't even know what they really want. We all love a bit of everything, sure, but mainstream horror sits in a paradox of trying way too hard to show so little. An innovative, socially relevant horror that tapped into our fear of the unknown is now a product of modern complacency to trust an audience to have patience. Because, well, as the 2016 film demonstrated, younger audiences, the demographic willing to flock for a cheap scare, don't have the patience to embrace what isn't spoon-fed to them. So, are the Blair Witch sequels good? Well, out of context, yes, they work independently of each other, but in consideration of the cultural landscape that allows horror to truly explore human fragility in an age of increasing domestic fear, well, these sequels dilute the core ethos of the original to the point it no longer has a taste.